Fire was not the cruelest thing that night. As black smoke swallowed my lungs, I reached out to the man I called father. He did not reach back. Instead, he shoved me backward into the roaring flames to clear an escape path for his precious son. What burned my soul was not the heat of 1,000 degrees, but my mother standing safely outside the doorway. She looked at me and smiled. A perfect, satisfied, freezing smile. Hello, wonderful listeners of Maya Revenge Stories. Unfortunately, YouTube has completely demonetized our channel, leaving us with zero budget to keep producing these episodes for you. If you find today's story compelling, please consider supporting us by joining our Patreon to listen to exclusive, unbelievable true stories with a full cast of emotional voices that we simply cannot make public on YouTube. You can easily join by scanning the quick response code right on your screen or by clicking the Patreon link down in the description or the pinned comment of this video. Now, let us begin today's story, where I, Cassidy Schultz, learned the true meaning of family loyalty. I was 28 years old, sitting pretty as a top executive, when my entire world literally caught fire. It was the dead of night inside our isolated family estate, a sprawling mansion nestled deep in the shadows of Blackwood Valley. I was jolted awake from a deep, exhausting sleep, not by a gentle tap on the shoulder or the morning sun, but by the shrieking, frantic wail of the fire alarms piercing through the absolute silence of the house. Before I could even manage to open my eyes fully, the harsh, acrid stench of burning chemicals violently invaded my nostrils. This was not the familiar smell of wood or fabric catching a stray spark from the fireplace. It was thick, toxic, and suffocating. The kind of chemical burn that immediately makes your eyes water and your throat close up. My instincts kicked into high gear instantly. I threw off my heavy blankets and scrambled blindly toward the bedroom door. The moment I yanked the brass handle open, a solid, moving wall of pitch-black smoke hit me like a physical blow to the chest. The second floor was already a terrifying nightmare of blinding heat and roaring destruction. I tore my silk robe off and tied it tightly over my mouth and nose, dropping down onto my hands and knees to find a pocket of breathable air near the floorboards. I crawled frantically toward the main staircase, the wood blistering against my palms. Through the dense, swirling smog, I saw two familiar silhouettes moving wildly ahead of me. It was my father, Arthur, and my younger brother, Julian. They were coughing uncontrollably, panicked, sprinting toward the landing that led down to the safety of the front doors. "Dad," I screamed, my voice cracking and failing as the thick soot tore at my vocal cords. "Julian, wait for me." They both turned at the sound of my voice. I saw the sheer, unadulterated terror in Arthur's eyes, but in a fraction of a second, I realized that terror was not for my safety. Above us, a massive, sickening groan echoed through the corridor. A huge section of the blazing ceiling was detaching from the support beams, ready to crash down and completely seal off the top of the stairs. We had mere seconds, maybe even less, before the exit was gone. We were all crammed dangerously near the edge of the descent. In a split second where survival instincts take over, a father is universally expected to shield his children at all costs. Arthur did make a choice in that moment, without a single fraction of hesitation. His left hand shot out and clamped like a vice into the collar of Julian's shirt, hauling the young boy violently forward and down the first step. At the exact same instant, his right hand slammed squarely into the center of my chest. He did not just brush me aside in the chaos. He drove his heavy palm into me with a brutal, calculated force, using my body weight as leverage to propel himself and Julian downward. I was thrown violently backward, my feet entirely leaving the ground as I was hurled straight back into the churning, roaring vortex of the inferno. Time slowed to a torturous, agonizing crawl as I fell backwards into the heat. I tumbled down the upper hallway, rolling helplessly toward the encroaching wall of fire that was rapidly eating the wallpaper. Through the rapidly narrowing gap of the grand staircase, just before the ceiling completely collapsed, I saw the massive front doors of the mansion fly open. The cool night air rushed in, feeding the hungry flames even more, and standing right there on the pristine front porch, perfectly safe from the destruction, was my mother, Evelyn. She was not running inside to help us. She was not screaming my name in absolute terror. She had her arms outstretched, calmly waiting to receive her golden boy, Julian. As Arthur shoved Julian out the door into her arms, Evelyn slowly looked up, her cold eyes locked directly onto mine through the roaring orange haze. As I lay there on the burning floor, choking on poison, watching the ceiling begin to cave in on top of me, my mother smiled. It was not a grimace of shock or a trick of the dancing light. It was a perfectly formed, completely satisfied, bone-chilling smile of absolute triumph. She watched the fire rise up to claim my life, and she smiled as if she had just won a grand prize. The heavy oak doors slammed shut with a definitive thud. The concussion of those doors closing seemed to break the final structural beam holding the ruined floor together. The ground beneath me gave way with a deafening crack. I plummeted into the darkness, completely surrounded by flaming debris and falling beams. But I did not hit the burning living room below. Our mansion was built directly on top of a highly secure, temperature-controlled subterranean server vault that my father used for his business. The massive impact shattered the floorboards straight through the main level, sending me free-falling into the reinforced concrete depths of the underground basement. I slammed brutally into the cold steel grate of the server floor. The temperature plunged from deadly, blistering heat to freezing in an instant. The thick, insulated walls of the subterranean vault blocked out the raging inferno above, miraculously saving me from being instantly incinerated. But the brutal impact shattered my collarbone and snapped several of my ribs. Pure agony ripped through my entire body, paralyzing my lungs, before a merciful wave of absolute blackness finally pulled me under. I would learn much later what happened outside on the grass while I lay bleeding and unconscious in the dark pit. By the time the rural fire department and police sirens finally echoed through the valley, the Schultz family was already putting on the performance of a lifetime. They collapsed onto the manicured front lawn, clutching each other and weeping hysterically for the cameras and the neighbors. Arthur beat his fists against the grass in a display of faux agony. Evelyn wailed into the night sky, perfectly formed tears streaming down her face as she sobbed into the arms of the first responders. They claimed the fire spread entirely too fast for anyone to react. They claimed I was tragically trapped in the East Wing, and they could not reach me. They stood there, bathed in the flashing red and blue lights of the emergency vehicles, holding each other tight, and boldly declared to the authorities that their beloved daughter had burned to death inside. The first sensation was not pain, but the stark, biting smell of bleach and rubbing alcohol. It was a sharp, clinical contrast to the suffocating ash that had been my last memory. I dragged my heavy eyelids open, staring up at a water-stained, acoustic ceiling tile that definitely did not belong in the pristine halls of my family estate. Every breath felt like dragging jagged pieces of broken glass through my chest. I turned my head slowly, wincing as the stiff, cheap hospital sheets rubbed against the thick bandages wrapping my shoulder and ribs. Sitting in a faded plastic chair beside my narrow bed was a burly, imposing man in a soot-stained uniform. It was Fire Captain Vance. I recognized him instantly from the lavish annual charity galas my parents hosted. He leaned forward, his weathered face etched with grim exhaustion and deep concern. "Welcome back to the land of the living, Jane Doe," Vance rumbled, his voice low and exceptionally cautious. "You are in a remote county clinic, about 40 miles outside the valley. I brought you here through the underground service tunnels connecting your subterranean vault to the old municipal drainage system. No one else knows you made it out of that basement alive." Before I could force my raw vocal cords to form a single question, Vance reached for the remote control and clicked on the small television mounted high in the corner of the bleak room. The local news channel flared to life. There, filling the screen, was a live broadcast of a lavish, heartbreakingly beautiful memorial service. My memorial service, my parents, Arthur and Evelyn, stood at an ornate podium draped in black velvet and expensive white lilies. My father wore a perfectly tailored dark suit, his shoulders slumping in a flawless masterclass of fabricated grief. He was speaking softly into the microphone, calling me his brightest star, tragically taken far too soon by a horrific accident. My mother stood right beside him, delicately dabbing at her completely dry eyes with a monogrammed silk handkerchief. The news anchor's solemn voice cut in, announcing that the Schultz family was expected to receive a life insurance payout of exactly $10 million, framing it as a small comfort for the massive tragedy they had endured. I stared at the bright screen, my shattered ribs aching with every ragged breath. The sheer, unadulterated audacity of their performance was physically nauseating. They were standing over an empty coffin, collecting a literal fortune, and playing the ultimate, sympathetic victims to the entire world. Vance muted the television, his jaw tight. He reached inside his heavy fire-resistant jacket and pulled out a plain manila folder. He did not look at me with pity or sorrow. He looked at me exactly like a seasoned detective presenting a murder file to a key witness. I walked the perimeter of the primary burn zone before the state investigators officially took over the scene, Vance said, his tone shifting to something entirely clinical and sharp. Fires do not behave the way this one did. I found 3 distinct points of origin on the second-floor hallway. All 3 spots were heavily saturated with an accelerant, most likely a volatile household chemical mixture specifically designed to burn incredibly fast and exceptionally hot. This was not a faulty wire in the walls or a forgotten candle in the study. He opened the folder and laid a glossy photograph on the plastic tray table across my lap. It was a tight close-up shot of the heavy brass door handle to my bedroom, blackened and severely warped by the intense heat. "Look closely at the internal mechanism," he instructed quietly. I squinted at the glossy image. The keyhole and the edges of the turning latch were caked in a strange, thick, crystalline residue. "Someone coated your bedroom door handle with industrial-grade superglue while you were fast asleep," Vance explained, his eyes locking intensely onto mine. "It was specifically designed to jam the locking mechanism and delay you just long enough for the toxic smoke to do its job. If you had not forced it open with absolute, adrenaline-fueled panic, you would have died right there in your bed." The revelation hit me significantly harder than my father's brutal, physical shove on the staircase. The scattered, chaotic, terrifying fragments of that night suddenly slammed together into a perfectly constructed, horrifyingly clear picture. The glued door, the 3 simultaneous chemical ignition points, my father being fully dressed and ready to run, my mother standing calmly on the manicured lawn, waiting to catch her son, that freezing, satisfied, triumphant smile she gave me as the flames rose up to consume me. It was not a spontaneous act of cruelty in a moment of sheer panic. It was a cold, calculated, meticulously executed assassination plot. They chose fire because fire consumes absolutely everything. It eats the physical evidence. It destroys the chemical traces if it burns hot enough. And it neatly turns a premeditated murder into a tragic, unavoidable accident. I lay there, staring silently at the ceiling, feeling the very last remaining shreds of my familial love wither, crack, and turn to ash. The profound, agonizing heartbreak I felt just a few hours ago was rapidly evaporating from my system. In its place, something entirely new began to take root in the pit of my stomach. A dark, jagged, and intensely focused rage. It was a state of pure, absolute mental clarity. My mind, rigorously trained for years to audit complex financial structures and ruthlessly dismantle corporate lies, immediately began dissecting the crime scene of my own life. I was no longer a betrayed, grieving daughter mourning a broken bond. I was a corporate auditor, and my parents had just presented me with a fraudulent, blood-stained ledger. Vance slowly reached for his shoulder radio. "I need to call this in to the precinct. With my preliminary scene report and your direct testimony, we can have state troopers putting them in handcuffs before that lavish memorial service even ends." "No," I croaked, my voice raw, harsh, and dripping with venom, startling even myself. Vance froze completely, his thick hand hovering hesitantly over the communication device. Cassidy, they deliberately tried to burn you alive. They are actively covering up an attempted homicide right on national television. And if you arrest them right now, they will immediately hire the absolute best defense lawyers in the state, I said, my mind racing with cold, calculating logic. They will confidently claim the glue was a bizarre household accident. They will say the chemicals were just improperly stored cleaning supplies. And they will paint my testimony as the tragic hallucination of a severely traumatized burn victim. They wanted me to disappear permanently, so let them believe I am dead. I looked back at the muted television screen, watching my mother bow her head in fake, practiced sorrow for the flashing cameras. They did not try to violently murder me just because they did not love me. A hit this incredibly elaborate, a risk this massive, meant there was a motive much larger, much darker, than simply removing an unwanted child from the picture. There was a massive secret they were desperate to bury right along with my charred bones. "Keep this entirely quiet, Vance," I ordered, the sharp, executive authority fully returning to my broken voice. "I am going to slip right back into the very shadows they created for me. I am going to find out exactly why they needed me to burn, and when I do, I will not just send them to a comfortable prison cell. I will systematically take away absolutely everything they have ever cared about." Vance managed to procure a highly secure, completely untraceable laptop for me on my third day in the remote clinic. Propped up against the stiff hospital pillows, fighting through the agonizing, relentless throb of my fractured ribs, I went directly to work. The physical pain was a distant static compared to the absolute, razor-sharp focus dominating my mind. My fingers flew across the keyboard, initiating a silent, aggressive bypass of the standard security protocols protecting Ethelgard Biosciences. As the chief audit executive, and the very person handpicked by the board to be the next chief executive officer, I knew every single digital backdoor, every hidden server, and every blind spot in that massive corporate network. I did not need physical access to the skyscraper in the city. I just needed a stable internet connection and the burning desire to dismantle their empire piece by piece. I bypassed the two-factor authentication on the executive cloud and dove straight into the deepest, most restricted financial ledgers of the corporation. I started tracing the microscopic, seemingly insignificant anomalies I had noticed in the quarterly reports just before the fire. It took me 6 straight hours of decrypting nested spreadsheets, bypassing internal proxy servers, and cross-referencing encrypted bank routing numbers. But eventually, the heavily guarded, horrifying truth materialized on the glowing screen. It was a massive, perfectly orchestrated financial black hole. Exactly $200 million had been systematically and ruthlessly siphoned out of our primary research fund, a fund specifically dedicated to developing rare, life-saving drugs for terminally ill patients. The money had not simply vanished into administrative overhead. It had been meticulously laundered through a highly complex, labyrinthine web of offshore shell companies. I tracked the capital flowing from our corporate accounts into dummy corporations situated in various tax havens across the globe over the course of the past 5 years. And the digital signatures authorizing every single one of those phantom fraudulent transactions belonged exclusively to Arthur and Evelyn Schultz. The final, devastating puzzle piece violently clicked into place, illuminating the exact reason why I had to die that night. Just 1 week before the inferno consumed my bedroom, I had stood before the entire board of directors and formally flagged a strange, localized discrepancy in the offshore routing accounts. I had confidently and proudly promised them a comprehensive, fully transparent audit report by the very end of the current month. I had unwittingly painted a giant glowing target directly on my own back. I was the absolute last, immovable obstacle standing between my parents and their $200 million getaway. They did not just want to fire me or publicly discredit me, because my meticulous audit would have inevitably sent them both to federal prison for the rest of their natural lives. So, they decided to completely eradicate the auditor under the guise of a tragic family accident. While I was deeply embedded in the company cloud server, My elite administrative clearance allowed me to quietly sweep my parents' personal, heavily synced devices. I tapped into the automated cloud storage for our luxury family vehicle. The vehicle's internal dashcam system was hardwired to record cabin audio, automatically uploading the encrypted files to Arthur's private home server whenever the car was parked in the garage. I ran a quick search and found a critical audio file time-stamped exactly 3 hours before the fire alarms triggered that night. I clicked play, holding my breath, the silence of the hospital room amplifying the tension. The crisp, clear audio of my parents plotting in the pitch-black darkness of the garage filled the air. "Are you absolutely certain he will not wake up early and ruin the timeline?" Arthur asked, his voice tight with nervous, frantic energy. "I put a triple dose of prescription sedatives into his evening chamomile tea," Evelyn replied. Her tone was chillingly calm, entirely devoid of any recognizable maternal warmth, sounding more like a military general discussing collateral damage. "Julian will be completely dead to the world until we physically drag him out the front door. We need him groggy, confused, and terrified for the news cameras. He is our perfect, innocent alibi." A heavy, suffocating weight instantly lifted off my crushed chest, allowing me to take my first real breath in days. Julian. My little brother was not part of this monstrous, blood-soaked conspiracy. He had not stood outside and watched me burn willingly. He was nothing but an unwitting pawn, heavily drugged and ruthlessly manipulated to perfectly execute their theatrical, heroic rescue operation. They had actively risked his life, too, betting absolutely everything on their physical ability to haul his unconscious body out before the toxic smoke inhalation killed him in his sleep. As the audio recording abruptly ended, a silent, flashing notification appeared in the upper right corner of my screen. Because I had successfully mirrored Arthur's primary executive workstation, I now had real-time, undetected access to his heavily encrypted private email inbox. A brand new, completely anonymous message had just bypassed his expensive security filters. The subject line was entirely blank. I opened the encrypted text, my eyes scanning the hostile words. "I watched the local news broadcast. $10 million in life insurance, plus the massive corporate funds you are clearly hiding. My original fee for the chemical accelerants and the industrial superglue was entirely too low. Bring $1 million in unmarked, non-sequential cash to the abandoned rail yard by midnight tomorrow, or the state police will receive a highly detailed map of exactly how you started the fire. Do not even think about testing me. Arthur." I leaned back against the stiff hospital bed, a sharp, genuine laugh escaping my lips and immediately causing my broken ribs to scream in fiery protest. The sheer, delicious irony of the situation was absolutely intoxicating. My brilliant, ruthless, high society parents had hired a professional, underground arsonist to execute their perfect crime and lock my bedroom door. Now, the very monster they paid to eliminate me was turning around to completely devour them. Their flawlessly constructed elite facade was already beginning to fracture and crumble from the inside out. They were bleeding out, growing paranoid, and desperately trying to keep their criminal empire from imploding. They truly thought the fire had completely destroyed their only problem. They had absolutely no idea that the intense flames had merely forged me into their absolute worst nightmare. The physical wounds were slowly knitting themselves back together, but my mind was operating with the cold, frictionless efficiency of a high-speed processor. In the suffocating quiet of the remote clinic room, I prepared to execute a mathematical dismantling of the empire my parents had soaked in blood. I still held the ultimate, unrestricted administrative keys to the Ethelgard network, credentials I had deliberately hidden within a ghost directory months before my supposed death. The corporate financial system was a complex organism, but I knew precisely where to plunge the scalpel. Working methodically through the dead of night, I triggered a cascading sequence of command overrides. I bypassed Evelyn's sophisticated laundering protocols and systematically froze every single offshore shell corporation they had established. Then, transaction by transaction, I began the extraction. I silently routed exactly $200 million away from their hidden Caribbean accounts, funneling the entire stolen fortune into a highly classified, irrevocable trust fund solely registered under my own name. By the time the morning sun breached the horizon, my parents were utterly bankrupt in the shadows, entirely cut off from their stolen kingdom without a single alarm ever sounding on their end. But draining their illicit funds was merely severing the supply line. I needed to shatter their psychological armor. I asked Captain Vance to acquire a box of completely untraceable, high-grade stationery. Inside the very first envelope, I placed absolutely nothing but a 2-inch square of severely scorched, soot-stained silk. It was cut directly from the collar of the ruined robe I had worn on the night they condemned me to the flames. Vance mailed it to the lavish temporary estate my parents had rented in the neighboring upscale district. Through my continued surveillance of Arthur's synced devices, I watched the absolute chaos unfold the exact moment Evelyn opened that envelope. The digital audio from their temporary living room recorded her descending into pure, unadulterated panic. Her cold, calculated demeanor evaporated instantly. They were entirely convinced that their hired arsonist had somehow acquired a piece of my clothing from the wreckage to use as a gruesome trophy and a permanent blackmail tool. Evelyn, her voice trembling with a mixture of terror and lethal desperation, immediately commanded Arthur to take a large briefcase entirely filled with untraceable cash to the abandoned industrial sector on the edge of the city. Her instructions were explicit. Arthur was to pay the arsonist off, and then he was to silence the man permanently. They were playing a desperate game of survival, entirely oblivious to the fact that they were dancing perfectly to my tune. Captain Vance and I had meticulously rigged the designated meeting spot, an empty, rusting warehouse down by the old shipping yards, with 6 high-definition, motion-activated hidden cameras and state-of-the-art directional microphones. I sat up in my hospital bed, staring intently at the live feed on my secure laptop, watching my father step into the cavernous, shadowy building. Arthur clutched the heavy leather briefcase to his chest, his expensive designer shoes echoing loudly against the cracked concrete floor. He was sweating profusely, his eyes darting frantically into every dark corner. The arsonist, naturally, never showed up, but Arthur's sheer paranoia broke him before anyone even had to threaten him, pacing aggressively back and forth in the empty warehouse, convinced the blackmailer was watching him from the rafters. Arthur began to yell into the dark abyss. "I have the money right here," Arthur screamed, his voice cracking violently under the immense pressure. "Just take the cash and leave us alone. I did exactly what I had to do. You think I wanted to do it? I pushed my own daughter backward into a roaring fire. I drove my hands into her chest and threw her into the flames just to protect Evelyn and keep our perfect life intact. I killed my own flesh and blood, so this secret would stay buried. Now take your damn money and disappear." Every single syllable of his horrific, desperate confession was captured in crystal-clear audio and pristine, high-definition video. The sheer cowardice radiating from him was palpable. He had openly admitted to the physical act of murder, entirely unprompted, driven completely mad by the phantom pressure of a ghost. Captain Vance stood next to my bed, staring at the screen in absolute disbelief. He immediately reached for his radio to dispatch an arrest team to the warehouse. I reached out and firmly grabbed his wrist, shaking my head slowly. Sending the police to arrest Arthur would be entirely too simple, and it would give Evelyn an opportunity to cut him loose and play the victim once again. I had a much more devastating destination in mind for this masterpiece of a confession. I opened an encrypted messaging application and attached the video file. I did not send it to the local authorities, nor did I send it to the corporate board. I typed in the personal cell phone number of the one person who still believed in the immaculate facade of the Schultz family. I pressed send, directly delivering the footage of our father confessing to my brutal murder straight into the hands of my little brother, Julian. The demolition of his false reality had officially begun. The emergency shareholder assembly for Ethelgard Biosciences was convened exactly 48 hours after Arthur made his fatal, recorded confession in the damp shadows of the old shipping yards. The massive, glass-walled conference hall situated on the 50th floor of the corporate tower was packed to its absolute maximum physical capacity. The air inside the room was thick with anxious murmurs, the nervous shifting of expensive leather chairs, and the heavy, undeniable stench of incoming corporate instability. The sudden, tragic death of the heir apparent had sent the company's stock into a dangerous tailspin, and the powerful investors were demanding immediate reassurance. I was securely positioned in the high-tech audiovisual control room, suspended just above the main floor, watching the live security feed with an icy, unblinking focus. Down below, my parents were perfectly positioned at the front of the grand hall, bathing in the sympathetic gaze of the elite crowd. They were both draped in immaculate, custom-tailored black mourning attire, looking every bit the tragic, heartbroken founders who had just suffered an unimaginable family loss. Evelyn stood near the edge of the polished stage, her posture rigid, yet projecting a carefully manufactured vulnerability that demanded absolute pity. Arthur sat stiffly in the high-backed mahogany chair behind her, aggressively clutching a thick leather binder to his chest. I knew exactly what was inside that binder. My deep network infiltration had revealed their ultimate, desperate contingency plan. They had meticulously forged a complex series of binding legal documents designed to completely bypass the established corporate succession protocols. With me officially declared dead and out of the way, they were about to formally introduce Julian as the sole rightful heir to the entire Ethelgard empire, because he was legally young enough for them to heavily manipulate. He would serve as the perfect, innocent puppet to permanently cover up their $200 million theft. They were completely ready to seal the final lock on their stolen kingdom while bathing in the tears of their oblivious investors. The room slowly fell into a respectful, heavy silence as Evelyn solemnly approached the oak podium. She adjusted the delicate microphone with a trembling hand, letting out a perfectly timed, shaky sigh that echoed clearly through the massive overhead speakers. "Thank you all for being here during this incredibly dark and agonizingly painful time for our family," Evelyn began, her voice dripping with a sickly sweet, entirely fabricated sorrow. "We have lost our brightest light. My heart is completely shattered into a million pieces, but the vital, life-saving work of Ethelgard must continue for the sake of the patients who rely on us." My fingers hovered directly over the master override console on the control desk. I did not let her finish her next hypocritical sentence. With a single, decisive keystroke, I completely hijacked the centralized audio system of the entire skyscraper, instantly locking out the stage microphones. Evelyn opened her mouth to continue her tragic, award-winning monologue, but instead of her smooth voice, a harsh, frantic, heavily echoing shout violently ripped through the state-of-the-art surround sound speakers. The pristine, respectful acoustics of the boardroom were instantly shattered by the desperate, recorded audio of Arthur from the abandoned warehouse the night before. "I have the money right here. Just take the cash and leave us alone. I did exactly what I had to do. You think I wanted to do it? I pushed my own daughter backward into a roaring fire. I drove my hands into her chest and threw her into the flames just to protect Evelyn and keep our perfect life intact. I killed my own flesh and blood, so this secret would stay buried. Now take your damn money and disappear." The sheer, deafening volume of his frantic confession bounced violently off the thick glass walls. The entire assembly hall froze in a state of absolute, paralyzed horror. Hundreds of wealthy shareholders, elite board members, and high-ranking executives sat totally motionless, the blood rapidly draining from their faces. On the stage, Arthur dropped the heavy leather binder. It hit the hardwood floor with a loud thud, scattering the forged inheritance documents everywhere like meaningless trash. He began to hyperventilate rapidly, his hands shaking violently as he looked around wildly, entirely unable to comprehend how his deepest, darkest, most lethal sin was currently being broadcast to the entire corporate world. Before the chaotic murmurs could erupt into full-blown panic, I stood up and pushed through the heavy side door of the control room, I walked slowly down the carpeted stairs leading directly to the main assembly floor. The massive mahogany double doors at the back of the conference hall swung open with a loud, commanding creak that cut right through the rising tension. I stepped into the blinding fluorescent light of the room. I was entirely draped in a sharply tailored, pure white suit, a deliberate, aggressive contrast to the sea of black mourning clothes worn by the traders on the stage. The sleeves of my jacket were slightly pulled back, openly revealing the faint, jagged, pink burn scars wrapping around my wrists and hands. Every single head in the cavernous room snapped backward to look at me. The collective gasp from the audience sucked all the oxygen out of the room. The silence that followed was so absolute, so profoundly heavy, that the faint hum of the air conditioning sounded like a roaring jet engine. I was the ghost they had just mourned, standing firmly in the flesh, bearing the undeniable physical marks of my parents' absolute betrayal. "I am afraid the reports of my death were severely fabricated," I said, my voice projecting loud, clear, and perfectly steady across the frozen room, utterly devoid of any fear or hesitation. Arthur let out a pathetic, strangled gasp. His knees buckled completely beneath his own weight. He collapsed directly onto the polished stage floor, utterly broken, stammering incoherently as he stared at me like a man staring directly at his own executioner. But Evelyn did not break. The sheer, terrifying magnitude of her sociopathy flared to life in an instant. Her survival instincts were entirely devoid of human empathy or maternal love. In a fraction of a second, Evelyn spun around and pointed a trembling, fiercely accusatory finger directly at her hyperventilating husband on the floor. Tears immediately streamed down her face. Not fake tears of mourning, but genuine, desperate tears of a cornered predator willing to chew off its own leg to survive. "He is a monster!" Evelyn shrieked, her voice echoing with a horrifyingly convincing pitch of absolute devastation and betrayal. "He lied to me. He told me she was trapped in the hallway. He told me he tried everything to save her. I had absolutely no idea he did this, Arthur. How could you? How could you murder our own child?" The sheer audacity of her performance sent a chilling shockwave through my chest. She was violently throwing the man who had burned his own daughter just to protect her directly under a speeding train, all without a single blink of hesitation. But she was not finished. Evelyn swiftly reached into the hidden compartment of the podium and pulled out a completely different, heavily sealed manila folder. She slammed it down onto the microphone stand, turning her vicious, tear-streaked face toward the frozen board of directors. "Do not listen to a single word she says," Evelyn screamed, her eyes burning with a manic, desperate fire as she pointed her manicured finger directly at me. "Look at her, look at the scars. She survived the fire because she is the one who started it. My daughter has been suffering from severe, undiagnosed psychotic delusions for the past 2 years. I have her private, deeply disturbing psychiatric records right here. She has been plotting to completely destroy this family and forcefully seize absolute control of Ethelgard Biosciences. She staged this entire horrifying tragedy, nearly killing her own brother, just to frame her own father and steal the company from us." The grand hall instantly descended into absolute, unprecedented chaos. Dozens of people were shouting aggressively over each other. Security guards were hesitating at the main doors, completely unsure of who to apprehend or who to protect. I watched closely as the senior members of the executive board exchanged nervous, highly uncertain glances. Evelyn was an absolute master manipulator, a corporate siren who had spent decades weaving a flawless, impenetrable web of trust and authority. Even with Arthur's damning audio confessions still ringing clearly in their ears, her sheer, unwavering conviction, her desperate tears, and the presence of her fabricated medical records were introducing a lethal, highly contagious dose of doubt into the room. Some of the most powerful people in the company were actually beginning to waver, momentarily mesmerized by the venomous, calculated lies spilling from her mouth. I stood perfectly still in my white suit, maintaining a cold, unyielding glare from the back of the room. I knew that my words alone would never be enough to completely penetrate the thick armor of Evelyn's lifelong deception. But I did not need to speak or frantically defend myself. I had already set the final, inescapable trap, and the true executioner was already waiting in the wings, entirely ready to deliver the final blow. The board members were murmuring loudly, shifting their weight in their expensive leather chairs, completely disoriented by Evelyn's masterful, tear-soaked performance. Some of the oldest investors were actually nodding slowly, entirely ready to believe her fabricated psychiatric files over the truth standing right in front of them. She stood there, breathing heavily, a cornered predator playing the ultimate, tragic victim. I watched her from the back of the room, my white suit practically glowing under the harsh fluorescent lights, waiting for the final piece of the puzzle to drop. Suddenly, a quiet, unsteady voice broke through her manic, desperate plea. Julian stepped out from the heavy shadows near the edge of the stage. He did not look like the pampered, naive, golden boy they had so carefully raised and protected. He looked completely shattered, sleep-deprived, and yet strangely, beautifully resolute. He walked right past Arthur's pathetic, whimpering form on the floor and stood directly next to our mother at the polished oak podium. Before Evelyn could even register his presence or try to manipulate him, Julian pulled out a small, encrypted black flash drive and jammed it violently into the master presentation console. The massive digital projector behind them flickered and buzzed. The fake medical records on the giant screen vanished instantly, immediately replaced by high-definition, blown-up screenshots of highly incriminating text messages, offshore banking authorizations, and black-market wire transfers. Julian had received the video of Arthur's warehouse confession 2 days ago. Instead of confronting them blindly and giving them a chance to lie, my little brother had quietly and methodically stolen Evelyn's heavily encrypted secondary phone while she slept. He had spent the last 48 hours downloading every single piece of her horrific, blood-soaked digital footprint. Evelyn froze, the fake tears drying on her cheeks instantly as she stared at the undeniable proof of her own monstrous greed plastered across the 50-foot wall. Julian turned his head, looking directly into Evelyn's horrified, widened eyes. "She shielded me from the flames," Julian said, his voice trembling at first, but rising to echo with absolute, devastating finality. "But you used fire to burn this family down." The invulnerable, sociopathic wall of Evelyn Schultz collapsed into dust right before my eyes. She let out a guttural, animalistic shriek, lunging desperately toward the console to rip the drive out, but before her manicured fingers could even brush the plastic. The heavy mahogany doors at the back of the room burst open again. Captain Vance marched in, flanked by a dozen heavily armed, undercover state investigators. They swarmed the stage in mere seconds. Vance practically lifted Arthur off the floor by his expensive collar, slapping heavy steel handcuffs onto his shaking wrists. 2 female officers aggressively pinned Evelyn against the podium, forcibly locking her hands tightly behind her back. She thrashed Willie, her perfect hair flying in every direction, screaming absolute, venomous curses at me as they dragged her kicking and screaming down the center aisle of the stunned boardroom. The board of directors did not waste a single moment after the authorities cleared the room. The sheer mountain of irrefutable digital evidence presented by both siblings was entirely overwhelming. An emergency vote was called before the police sirens even faded in the distance outside the glass walls. Within 15 minutes, Arthur and Evelyn Schultz were completely stripped of all their corporate shares, their executive titles, and every last ounce of their remaining dignity. The board formally, officially, and unanimously reinstated me as the sole, undisputed Chief Executive Officer of Ethelgard Biosciences. Exactly 1 year later, the harsh, biting chill of that horrific night was nothing more than a distant, fading memory. I stood proudly in the warm afternoon sun, gazing up at the gleaming glass facade of the brand-new, state-of-the-art burn trauma research center that our corporation had just fully funded. Standing right beside me, looking sharp and incredibly grown up in a crisp, olive-green uniform, was Julian. He was leaving for his very first military deployment, deliberately choosing to walk away from the toxic, inherited wealth of our dark bloodline to build his own honor from the ground up. I hugged him tightly, immensely proud of the honorable man he was forcing himself to become. As I watched his military transport vehicle drive away down the tree-lined avenue, I slowly raised my left hand. I gently ran my fingertips over the pale, jagged scar tissue wrapping around my wrist. I smiled, a genuine, warm, and deeply satisfied smile. This was no longer a brutal reminder of a father who violently pushed me away or a mother who wanted me to turn to ash. It was the eternal, undeniable medal of a woman who walked directly through hell, looked the devil right in the eye, and put the fire out with her bare hands. Thank you so much, incredible listeners, for joining me on this intense journey today. Please let me know down in the comments exactly where you are listening from, as I absolutely love seeing our community grow across the globe. If you found today's story powerful and engaging, please help us keep the channel alive by joining the Maya Revenge Stories Patreon. There, you can listen to our very best, exclusive true stories that we simply cannot make public on YouTube. You can join right now by scanning the quick response code on your screen or by using the Patreon link located in the description or the pinned comment below.